It was a quiet evening in the city, the kind of evening where most people long to return home, change into something comfortable, and enjoy the peace of their own space. The tall man stepped out of his dark car and stretched his shoulders. He had spent the entire day in meetings that felt endless, conversations filled with careful words, and responsibilities that carried a heavy weight. To the world outside, he was known as someone important, someone whose job demanded not only intelligence but also the ability to carry a nation's trust. Yet, in this moment, he wasn't the FBI director. He was simply a man returning to the home he loved, a place that brought him peace after the noise of the world. The neighborhood was calm and well kept. Wide sidewalks ran along the front yards, trimmed grass lined the streets, and the evening sun cast a golden glow across the windows of the houses. Birds rested on the rooftops, their soft calls mixing with the distant hum of traffic. For him, this place had always been a safe corner of the world, a retreat where he could step away from the pressures of work and be just another neighbor, just another homeowner who cared about his family and his privacy. He parked his car by the driveway, stepped out slowly, and carried a small bag that held some files he still needed to review later. Though he worked at one of the most powerful institutions in the country, he never showed off his position. He wore simple clothes that evening, a plain shirt and trousers, nothing that spoke of authority or wealth. He believed the home was meant to be a place where titles disappeared, and one could simply breathe without judgment. With a soft sigh, he walked toward his front door, glad to finally be home. But what he did not know was that someone else was watching. A police cruiser rolled slowly down the quiet street. Inside sat an officer who had been assigned to patrol the area. The officer noticed the tall man walking toward the house, and instead of seeing a homeowner returning home, suspicion took root. The officer slowed the car further, eyes narrowing as if the sight of this man stepping into his own yard was something unusual, something wrong. The house looked upscale, the kind of house the officer assumed someone like him should not belong to. Assumptions began to cloud his judgment before he had even spoken a word. The man, unaware of the officer's growing suspicion, reached his door and searched his pocket for his keys. He thought only about the quiet dinner he would have later and perhaps a late-night call with one of his colleagues. The officer, however, had already parked his cruiser at the edge of the street. He stepped out, placing his hand near his belt in a way that carried silent authority. His shoes crunched against the gravel as he approached, his face set in a hard expression. For him, this was not a man going home. This was a stranger who did not look right for the house he was entering. "Hey, you," the officer's voice broke the stillness of the evening. The man looked up, puzzled, the keys still in his hand. His brows furrowed slightly, not in anger but in confusion. He had lived here for years. He had greeted neighbors, waved at delivery drivers, and walked along the street without issue. Now, a police officer was calling out to him like he was an intruder. "Yes, officer," he replied politely, his tone calm but uncertain. He wondered if perhaps there had been a mistake, maybe a report of suspicious activity nearby. He had always taught himself to remain respectful in any situation, to choose words carefully. Yet there was a flicker of discomfort in his chest, a feeling that told him this encounter was not going to be simple. "What are you doing here?" the officer asked, his eyes scanning the man from head to toe. There was no warmth in his tone, only suspicion. The man blinked, surprised by the question. It seemed so obvious he was standing at the door of his own house, with keys in hand. He forced a gentle smile. "This is my home," he said, gesturing lightly to the door. "I live here." The officer shook his head, his lips tightening. "I don't think so. I haven't seen you around here before. This isn't your property. Tell me who you really are and what you're doing." The words sank heavily into the air. The man took a slow breath, keeping his composure. In his career, he had faced far more dangerous situations than this, but something about being questioned in front of his own home by someone who refused to see the truth was unsettling. He held up his keys, the small silver pieces that gave him entry to his house. "I live here," he repeated gently. "I've been here for years." The officer's eyes narrowed further. His suspicion had turned into disbelief, as if no matter what explanation was given, it would not be enough. He took another step closer, lowering his voice but not his tone of authority. "Do you have ID? Show me some proof right now." The man considered his options. He did have his wallet in his bag, with not only his driver's license but also identification that could immediately change the officer's tone. But revealing his true position too quickly felt unnecessary, even dangerous in its own way. He wanted to see where this conversation was headed. He wanted to observe the man in front of him not as an FBI director, but as someone experiencing the everyday reality that so many others had faced before him. "I can get my ID from inside," he replied, still calm. "But I assure you, this is my house." His voice carried a firmness now, not angry but steady, like someone used to standing his ground without raising his volume. By this time, a couple of neighbors had peeked out from behind curtains or open porches. They were curious about the voices outside, curious about the police cruiser parked on their quiet street. Some of them recognized the man at the door, though they couldn't hear the words being exchanged. They whispered to each other, wondering what the officer wanted. The man noticed them too, feeling their eyes on him, and an uncomfortable heaviness settled in his chest. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the picture being painted to those around him, a man at his own house being treated like he didn't belong. The officer folded his arms and shook his head again. "You'll need to prove it. Otherwise, I'll have to take this further." His voice carried a threat, not hidden but clear, as if he had already made up his mind about what was happening. The man tightened his grip on his keys. He could have snapped back, he could have raised his voice and demanded respect, but that wasn't his way. Instead, he chose to breathe slowly, his mind calm but alert. Inside, however, a storm was rising. He was the director of the FBI, a man trusted with national secrets, a man who had earned his position through years of dedication and excellence. Yet here he stood, accused of trespassing at his own home, treated as though his word meant nothing. And so, the evening that was supposed to be ordinary, quiet, and comforting had already shifted. The stage was set for a confrontation that would grow far beyond a single driveway, far beyond a single man and a single officer. It was the beginning of a story that would reveal truths not just about power and identity, but about the deep assumptions that shaped the way people looked at each other. The silence between the two men stretched longer than it should have. The tall man, still standing at his own front door, felt the officer's gaze heavy on him, filled with doubt instead of reason. The officer's hand rested near his belt, his body stiff with suspicion, as though every move the homeowner made was an attempt to hide something. The man had seen this posture before during his years of service. It was the stance of someone preparing for conflict, not conversation. Yet, this was his own property, and he refused to let frustration guide his actions. He lowered his bag to the ground slowly, showing he had nothing in his hands except the keys. His movements were deliberate, calm, and measured, because he knew that sudden actions could be misread. With patience, he tried again. "Officer, I am telling you the truth. This is my house. I live here. My name is on the deed, I pay the taxes, and the neighbors know me. There must be a misunderstanding." But the officer's eyes stayed sharp, his jaw tight. "I don't care what you say. I need to see identification right now. People like you don't just walk into houses like this. Show me proof, or I will have to take you in." His words, sharp and cold, landed like stones. To him, it was a simple order. To the man at the door, it was an insult disguised as procedure. He felt the weight of those words pressing on him, not only for himself but for what they implied about how he was seen. In his long career, he had stood in front of senators, presidents, and world leaders who had trusted his judgment, his word, and his expertise. Yet, here he was, in front of his own home, treated like a trespasser. He took another deep breath, reminding himself of the discipline he had practiced for years. The key to his strength was not reacting with anger, but with control. "I will get my ID," he said evenly, though his voice carried a firmness now. "It's in my bag. Let me reach for it." His eyes met the officer's, holding them with a calm steadiness that said he had nothing to hide. He bent slightly, opened his bag, and pulled out his wallet. The officer's hand twitched closer to his belt as he moved, and the man noticed. He paused, then slowly raised his wallet in plain sight, making sure his actions were clear. He flipped it open and showed his driver's license, the address matching the very house they stood in front of. The officer snatched the license from his hand and examined it under the dim streetlight. His eyes darted between the card and the man, his suspicion still strong. "This doesn't mean much," he muttered, shaking his head. "People forge these things. It doesn't prove you live here." His words, once again, brushed aside the truth in front of him. The man's patience was tested. He had already provided proof, yet it was dismissed as if his existence could never be legitimate in the eyes of this officer. Still, he kept his voice level, though it carried a quiet edge now. "That is a government-issued ID. My name and my address are right there. I live here." His eyes stayed locked on the officer's, unwilling to shrink under the weight of false suspicion. By now, a few more neighbors had stepped outside, drawn by the rising tension. Some stood on their porches, while others leaned over fences, whispering in confusion. They saw the man they had greeted countless times being questioned like a stranger. Some recognized his calm face and the way he carried himself with quiet authority. But no one intervened. They only watched, uncertain of how far the scene would go. The officer, however, seemed determined to push further. He handed the license back without acknowledgement and pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, I've got a possible trespassing suspect. Requesting backup." His voice was clipped and professional, but the words were heavy with assumption. The man heard every syllable, and each one felt like a cut, turning his home into a crime scene in the eyes of the one who was supposed to protect. The tall man took another deep breath. He could feel the anger rising inside, but he pressed it down. He had spent years mastering the art of control, knowing that showing too much emotion in moments like these only gave power to those who doubted him. Yet, deep inside, a quiet pain grew. He was not only fighting for his dignity but for the truth of who he was, for the right to simply exist in his own home without being treated like a suspect. The officer's hand hovered near his cuffs now. His body language was clear, he did not believe a word the man had said. "You're going to have to come with me until we sort this out," he said. The words sounded final, as if no argument could change his decision. The man at the door straightened, his tall figure rising with quiet strength. His calm tone remained, but his eyes sharpened with resolve. "Officer, I have shown you my ID. I have told you this is my home. I am not going anywhere. You are making a mistake." The air grew heavier. The neighbors whispered more loudly now, some pulling out phones to record the scene. The man noticed, but he said nothing. Part of him wanted the world to see this moment, to witness how quickly assumptions could turn truth into doubt. Still, he held back from revealing the one fact that would end this encounter instantly: that he was the director of the FBI. He wanted to see how far the officer's disbelief would go. Would the truth only matter if it came with a title? The officer's radio crackled with a reply, confirming that backup was on the way. The man exhaled slowly, his patience tested to its limits. He thought of all the people who had faced similar moments, people without the shield of power or recognition that he secretly carried. He thought of how their words must have felt dismissed, how their truth must have felt invisible. And now, Standing on his own porch, he felt the same. As the officer's eyes stayed cold and doubtful, the man realized something profound. This encounter was no longer just about him. It was about the deeper truth of how people were judged not by their character, not by their actions, but by assumptions tied to their appearance. And though he held back his true identity, he knew the moment was building towards something greater, something that would leave an unforgettable mark not just on the officer, but on everyone who witnessed it. The evening had shifted again. What began as a simple return home had turned into a confrontation of trust, doubt, and hidden truths. The man stood steady, his quiet strength unshaken, even as the flashing lights of another cruiser appeared at the far end of the street. The story was far from over, and he knew that what came next would reveal more than the officer expected. The street grew brighter as another police car pulled up, its headlights cutting through the calm evening. The quiet neighborhood, which had always been peaceful, now looked like the scene of an unfolding drama. The tall man, still standing by his front door, felt the tension thicken in the air as the second officer stepped out of the cruiser. The first officer waved him over, already telling his version of the story. To them, it was a case of a suspicious man trying to enter a house he did not own. To the man himself, it was a disturbing picture of mistrust painted right on his own doorstep. The second officer approached, scanning the man carefully. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone more curious than aggressive. The first officer spoke quickly, eager to frame the situation before the man could explain. "Caught him trying to enter this house. Claims he lives here, but I don't buy it. ID looked questionable. Could be fake." The tall man clenched his jaw lightly. His ID was not questionable. It was real, valid, and matched the house behind him. Yet here he was, accused of lying, accused of pretending to live in a place that was truly his home. He raised his voice slightly, not with anger but with authority. "This is my house. I've lived here for years." I showed him my ID, which proves it. "I don't know why that's not enough." His words were clear, his tone steady. The second officer glanced at him, then at the first, sensing the unease in the situation. He took the ID again and checked it, holding it closer under the light. The address matched the home, the photo matched the man standing before him. Still, doubt lingered in his eyes, not because of the card, but because of the assumptions filling his mind. "You understand," the second officer began slowly, "we have to be sure. There have been reports of people trying to break into houses around here. We can't just take your word for it." The man took a deep breath, keeping his composure. "I'm not asking you to take my word. I'm asking you to look at the facts. My ID matches the house. The neighbors know me. If you need more proof, I can show you bills, documents, whatever you want. But stop treating me as if I don't belong here." His voice grew firmer, carrying the weight of someone who was tired of having to prove his very presence. The neighbors leaned closer, some whispering nervously, others filming quietly on their phones. Their faces showed a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. They had seen this man mow his lawn, greet delivery drivers, and carry groceries. Yet now they were watching him being cornered like a stranger. Some wanted to step forward, but hesitation held them back. What if they were wrong? What if speaking up caused trouble for them too? So they stood still, watching a moment they would later replay in their minds again and again. The first officer grew more impatient. "Enough of this. Sir, step away from the door. Put your hands behind your back." His words cut through the air sharply, and he reached for his cuffs. The man stiffened, his body tall and commanding even in the face of insult. His deep voice rang out, calm but unwavering. "No, I am not stepping away from my house. I have given you proof, and you refuse to accept it. You are making a mistake." The firmness in his tone made both officers pause. There was no fear in his voice, only a quiet authority that seemed out of place for someone they thought was an intruder. The first officer's hand hovered near the cuffs, but something about the man's steady gaze gave him pause. He could not quite explain it, but there was a presence in this man, a strength that felt larger than the moment. Still, pride and bias pushed him forward. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he warned. The tall man's eyes did not waver. He spoke with patience, but his words carried weight. "It is already harder than it should be. I am standing at my own front door, and instead of welcoming me home, you are trying to drag me away. What does that say about fairness? About truth?" The second officer hesitated, his eyes flicking between the ID in his hand and the man before him. Something about the way the man spoke, his composure, his calm strength, made him uneasy. He had met many suspects before, but none carried themselves this way. None spoke with this kind of quiet authority. Doubt began to stir in his mind, not about the man, but about the choices they were making in this very moment. "Maybe we should slow down," he suggested carefully, but the first officer brushed him off, too caught in his own certainty to listen. The man could feel his patience thinning, but he held it in place. Years of discipline guided him. He thought of the countless situations he had faced, meetings with world leaders, tense negotiations, critical decisions where lives depended on him staying calm. Compared to those, this was small. And yet, this felt personal in a way that those moments never had. Because this was not about work or politics. This was about who he was, standing in front of his own house, being told he did not belong. The flashing lights of another cruiser lit up the street, reflecting off the windows of the houses. More officers stepped out, called in by the first officer's radio report. The man stood tall as they approached, his keys still in his hand, his wallet back in his pocket. To them, he looked like a suspect surrounded by law enforcement. To him, it felt like the weight of injustice pressing harder on his chest. He knew he could end this at any second by showing his FBI credentials, by revealing the truth of who he was. But something inside him held back. He wanted them to see him as he was in that moment, a man, a neighbor, a homeowner. Not a title, not a badge. Just a person who deserved respect. As more officers arrived, the scene became heavier. The neighbors whispered louder, some recording openly now. The man stood steady, unshaken by the growing circle around him. Inside, he felt the anger rising, but he turned it into resolve. This was more than an encounter. This was a test not of him, but of those who claimed to serve justice. How far would they let assumptions blind them to the truth? How far would they go before realizing the mistake? The first officer, still set in his certainty, gave another order. "Hands behind your back. Last warning." The man's deep voice responded with calm defiance. "No, I will not be treated like a criminal at my own door. If you cannot see the truth now, then perhaps you are not looking for it." His words rang out clearly, cutting through the tense night. The officers shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his presence making them second-guess their steps. The street that was once quiet now felt like a stage, every eye watching, every phone recording, every whisper carrying. The man stood tall in the center, a symbol of patience and strength, while the officers stood around him, trapped in the shadow of their own assumptions. The night had reached its turning point, and though he still held back his true identity, the power of the moment was already growing. He knew the next move would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone watching. The flashing lights painted the street in red and blue, bouncing across the windows of the houses and making the quiet neighborhood feel like the center of a storm. The tall man stood silently at his own front door, calm but unshaken, while several officers circled around him. Each one had come expecting to find a trespasser. None had realized they were facing someone who was far more than what they imagined. The crowd of neighbors had grown larger now. Some stood close, whispering nervously, while others kept their distance but still held up their phones to capture the scene. The air was heavy with tension, as though everyone sensed something important was about to happen. The first officer, the one who had started it all, still held his cuffs ready. His jaw was tight, his eyes sharp, unwilling to admit he might be wrong. To him, this was about control. He could not back down without feeling as though he had lost. He raised his voice above the low murmurs of the crowd. "I gave you every chance. You're not cooperating, and that means you're resisting. You will come with us." His words cut through the air like cold steel, and his hand moved forward to take hold of the man. The tall man's voice rose, not in anger but in strength. "Stop." The single word carried a weight that made everyone pause for a second. It was not shouted. It was not desperate. It was spoken with such calm authority that even the air seemed to grow still. His dark eyes met the officer's, unwavering. "You have gone far enough," he said, his tone even but sharp like a blade of truth. "I have told you this is my home. I have given you proof. You have ignored the facts because of what you assumed about me. But now, I will end this." The officers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. The neighbors leaned in closer, sensing the moment was about to change. The tall man reached slowly into his bag once more, every movement careful and deliberate. The officers stiffened, their hands moving instinctively toward their belts, but he ignored their suspicion. He pulled out a dark leather wallet, larger than the one that held his driver's license. With a steady hand, he opened it and raised it for them all to see. The gold badge glimmered under the streetlight, polished and unmistakable. Alongside it was an identification card that bore not just his name but his title: Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For a moment, silence swept the street. The weight of the reveal hung in the air, pressing down on everyone who had doubted him. The officers froze, their eyes widening as the truth sank in. The man they had been accusing of trespassing was the very man who led the nation's top law enforcement agency. The first officer's face drained of color. His hand that had been ready to cuff now hung uselessly at his side. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. The second officer, who had shown some doubt earlier, stepped back a pace, his eyes flicking from the badge to the man's steady face. The other officers shifted uncomfortably, shame creeping into their expressions as the reality of their mistake struck them like a heavy blow. The neighbors gasped softly, some whispering louder now, others holding their phones higher, capturing the stunned silence that followed the revelation. The tall man lowered the badge slowly, his eyes sweeping across the officers. His voice, calm but edged with steel, broke the silence. "You have treated me like a criminal in front of my own home. You ignored my ID, you ignored the facts, and you chose to see me as someone who could not belong here. But let me be perfectly clear: I am the director of the FBI. And I have spent my life upholding the law you claim to serve." His words rang with quiet power, echoing into the still night. "What does it say about your judgment if you cannot see the truth when it stands right in front of you?" The first officer's throat worked as he tried to speak. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice shaking. "Sir, but the man cut him off with a raised hand. "That is the point. You did not know. You did not ask the right questions. You did not take the time to look deeper. You judged me before you listened to me. And if I were not who I am, if I were not carrying this badge, what would you have done? Would you have arrested me in front of my own neighbors? Would you have dragged me to a station while my family waited inside?" His voice grew sharper now, not with rage but with the weight of truth. The neighbors whispered among themselves, their faces filled with shock and shame. Some looked at the officers with disapproval, while others looked at the man with a new kind of respect. The videos being recorded captured every word, every expression, every detail of a story that would soon spread far beyond this quiet street. The officers shifted uneasily, their faces betraying the weight of their mistake. The second officer lowered his head slightly, as though acknowledging his guilt in silence. The first officer, still frozen, looked as if the ground had vanished beneath him. The tall man's voice softened slightly, though it carried no less authority. I did not reveal who I was because I wanted to see how far you would go. I wanted to see whether the truth of my words was enough without the power of a title. And you showed me it was not. He paused, his eyes scanning each officer. This is not just about me. This is about what you do every day. If you treat someone like me this way, what happens to those without the power to defend themselves? What happens to those who cannot pull out a badge to make you stop? The words struck deep, and the silence that followed was heavy. The officers had no answer, and the neighbors watching felt the weight of his questions settle in their own hearts. The man closed his wallet and slipped it back into his bag. He stood taller now, though he had never truly bent. His presence filled the street, not with anger but with the undeniable truth of his authority and his humanity. He looked at the first officer one last time, his eyes steady. Remember this night, he said firmly. Remember it when you put on your uniform. Remember it when you speak to those you are sworn to serve. Because respect is not a privilege you give only to some. It is the right of all. The first officer nodded weakly, his voice caught in his throat. Yes, sir, he managed, though the words sounded hollow. The others shifted uncomfortably, some mumbling apologies, but the tall man did not need them. He turned slowly, unlocked his door with the keys that had been in his hand from the very beginning, and stepped inside his home. His back was straight, his movements calm, but his words lingered in the air like a storm that had not yet passed. Outside, the neighbors remained silent, their cameras still recording, their minds heavy with what they had just witnessed. The officers stood frozen in place, caught between shame and disbelief. The night had revealed more than they expected. It had shown them not only their mistake but the deeper truth about the judgments they carried, the assumptions they allowed to guide their actions. And as the tall man closed his door behind him, the story did not end. It had only grown larger, carried by the whispers of neighbors, the recordings on phones, and the weight of a lesson too powerful to ignore. The heavy wooden door closed softly behind him, shutting out the flashing lights, the murmurs of neighbors, and the stunned silence of the officers who had been left outside. Inside, the tall man leaned against the wall for a moment and drew a slow breath. It was not relief he felt, but a quiet ache, the kind that sits deep in the chest. He had faced powerful people, dangerous criminals, and life-or-death decisions in his career. Yet nothing struck him quite like being treated as a stranger in his own home. He set his bag down gently and removed his badge once more, staring at the golden shine as though it carried a question that had no easy answer. What use was power if the world could still refuse to see your truth until you proved it with authority? The house was still, filled only with the soft ticking of a clock in the hallway. For years, this place had been a sanctuary, a space where he could step away from endless responsibilities. But tonight, even within its walls, the peace felt cracked. He thought about the officer's words, the disbelief in his eyes even after being shown proof. He thought of the way his neighbors had whispered, unsure whether to defend him or stay silent. And above all, he thought about the truth he had chosen to reveal only at the very last moment. What if he had been someone without such a title? What if his badge had not been enough to stop what was already set in motion? Outside, the neighborhood was buzzing. Neighbors exchanged hurried words, their faces pale with guilt and surprise. Some put away their phones, unsure if they should keep the recordings or delete them, while others already knew those videos would spread quickly. The officers remained by their cruisers, the first one pacing nervously, the others standing still, their shoulders heavy with shame. They had not just made a mistake, they had embarrassed themselves in front of the very man who led the agency they looked up to, the agency that set the standard for law enforcement across the country. As minutes turned to an hour, the news began to travel. One neighbor called a friend, another sent a video to a relative, and before long the story was moving beyond the quiet street. People were talking, sharing, and reacting. The idea that the FBI director himself had been accused of trespassing on his own property was too powerful a story to remain hidden. It was not just about one man or one night. It was about something larger, something that spoke to the way assumptions shaped reality for so many. The tall man sat in his living room, the soft glow of a lamp filling the space. He thought about the officers outside, about how their faces had changed the moment they saw the badge. Respect, which should have been offered from the beginning, had only arrived when authority was revealed. It troubled him deeply. Respect, he believed, should be given to every person, not just to titles or uniforms. He wondered how many others had stood in the same position he had tonight, but without the power to end the story so quickly. That thought weighed on him more heavily than any embarrassment. The next morning, the story was everywhere. News stations carried the footage, headlines stretched across newspapers, and social media filled with clips of the night before. The videos taken by neighbors spread like wildfire, showing the moment when suspicion turned into shock, when the badge was revealed, and when the officer's certainty crumbled. People watched, shared, and commented, some in outrage, some in disbelief, and many in recognition. For countless viewers, the story felt familiar, a reflection of experiences they or their loved ones had faced in quieter, unseen corners of the world. The police department quickly issued a statement, promising an internal review. The first officer was placed under investigation, and questions rose about training, judgment, and accountability. The tall man did not ask for revenge, nor did he demand punishment. Instead, he quietly insisted on something deeper, reflection. He wanted the officers, and those who led them, to think carefully about what had happened and why. "This is not about me alone," he said in a calm press briefing days later. "This is about the duty to treat every person with fairness and dignity, no matter who they are or where they stand." His words were steady, but they carried weight, echoing far beyond the cameras. The neighbors, too, were changed. Those who had stayed silent that night now felt the sting of regret. They replayed the moment in their minds, wishing they had spoken up sooner, wishing they had stepped forward to say, "We know him. He lives here." Some came to his door in the days that followed, offering apologies, bringing kind words, and admitting their hesitation. He welcomed them with grace, not anger. He reminded them that silence, too, was a choice and that the choice to stand for truth was one they could always make in the future. The officers who had been present that night faced their own quiet storms. The second officer, the one who had shown a flicker of doubt, found himself deeply unsettled. He had seen the truth in the man's eyes, but he had allowed fear and loyalty to silence him. He thought about how different things could have been if he had spoken up earlier. The first officer, however, struggled with a heavier burden. Pride had blinded him, and prejudice had guided his choices. Now he found his career hanging by a thread, his actions replayed on screens across the nation, his name whispered in criticism. Through it all, the tall man carried himself with the same calm strength he had shown that night. He did not raise his voice, he did not call for anger, but he did not soften the truth either. He reminded those who listened that the heart of justice lay not in power, but in fairness. "A badge or a title should not be the reason you are believed," he said in one interview. "Truth should be enough. Humanity should be enough." His words touched people far and wide, opening conversations that had long been needed but often avoided. In the weeks that followed, training programs within the police department were revisited, discussions about bias and fairness grew louder, and officers were reminded of their oath to serve with dignity. The man's story had become more than a single incident. It had become a mirror, forcing people to see what they often chose not to see. And though he had not wanted the spotlight in this way, he accepted it if it meant others might be spared the same treatment in the future. One evening, weeks after the incident, he walked down the same street again, this time in peace. The neighbors waved warmly, some with sheepish smiles, others with genuine gratitude. Children rode their bikes nearby, laughter filling the air. The world outside seemed normal again, but he knew something had shifted. The memory of that night would not vanish. It would remain, not as a wound, but as a reminder. A reminder of the work still to be done, the lessons still to be learned, and the truth that respect is not optional, it is owed. Inside his home, he placed his badge on the table and looked at it quietly. To many, it was a symbol of authority and power. To him, it was also a reminder of responsibility. A responsibility not only to lead, but to stand as proof that respect must never depend on rank or title. He thought of the countless people who might never carry such a badge, yet deserved the same fairness he had fought for that night. And in that quiet reflection, he promised himself that he would not let the lesson be forgotten. The night of flashing lights and suspicion had turned into a story that touched countless hearts. It ended not with anger, but with a lesson about humility, dignity, and truth. The tall man had been tested in the simplest yet most personal way, standing at his own door, and he had shown the world that strength is not always in shouting, but in standing firm with calm and unwavering truth. And so the story closed with a message carried far beyond that street: respect must never depend on appearances, on uniforms, or on power. Respect belongs to everyone, equally, simply because they are human.